Imagine waking up one morning to find your entire city abandoned, your neighbors gone, your streets empty, and nobody left to tell you why. This is exactly what happened to the largest city in North America before European contact, and the answer to this mystery was hidden inside trees the whole time, waiting for us to learn how to read their secret language. Let me tell you something that will change how you see history forever. We always thought ancient people were at the mercy of nature, that they just lived simple lives and disappeared when things got tough. But what if I told you that the story is far more complex, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than anyone imagined? What if the collapse of an entire civilization wasn't about weakness or ignorance, but about a series of unfortunate events that could happen to any of us, even today? This is the story of Cahokia, a city that once housed more people than London at the same time in history. A place where massive pyramids touched the sky, where trade networks stretched for thousands of miles, and where human achievement reached heights that wouldn't be seen again in North America for centuries, and it all fell apart. But here's where it gets interesting. Trees remember what humans forget. Tree rings don't lie. They can't. Every year a tree adds a new ring, and that ring tells a story. A thick ring means good times, plenty of rain, warm sunshine, and happy growth. A thin ring means struggle, drought, cold snaps, and survival mode. Scientists call this Dendrochronology, which is just a fancy word for reading tree diaries. And when researchers started reading the diaries of trees that lived during Cahokia's time, they discovered something absolutely stunning. But before we dive into what those trees revealed, you need to understand just how incredible Cahokia really was. Picture this. It's the year 1050, and you're standing on top of a massive earthen pyramid called Monk's Mound. This thing is huge. We're talking 10 stories tall, covering 14 acres at its base. That's bigger than the Great Pyramid of Giza in terms of base area. Below you spreads a city of somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, maybe even more. Nobody knows the exact number, but what we do know is that this place was absolutely massive. The city stretched for 6 square miles. 6 square miles. That's not a village. That's not a town. That's a genuine urban center with all the complexity that comes with it. There were plazas where thousands could gather. Huge wooden posts arranged in circles that tracked the sun and stars like an ancient calendar. Residential neighborhoods with different social classes. Workshop areas where artisans created beautiful pottery and tools. And mounds, hundreds of mounds, each one representing countless hours of human labor. Now here's something that blows my mind every time I think about it. These people had no metal tools. None. No iron shovels. No bronze, pickaxes. Nothing. They built all of this with stone tools, wooden spades, and baskets. Do you understand how much work that takes? Modern estimates suggest that building Monk's Mound alone required moving more than 14 million baskets of earth. 14 million. Each basket carried on someone's back. Each load requiring someone to climb that growing pyramid again and again and again. But why? Why would anyone do this? What drives thousands of people to dedicate years of their lives to piling up dirt into massive mounds? This is where we start to understand that Cahokia wasn't just a city. It was an idea, a belief system, a way of understanding the universe that motivated people to achieve the seemingly impossible. The people of Cahokia were part of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, which is kind of a boring name for what was actually a fascinating civilization. These folks developed a complex society based on agriculture, primarily growing corn, beans, and squash. But it wasn't just about farming. They were master traders who connected with people from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Seashells from Florida, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachian Mountains. All of this flowed into Cahokia, and they had a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. Those wooden post circles I mentioned? They're called wood henge by archaeologists, and they functioned as incredibly accurate solar calendars. The posts aligned with the equinoxes and solstices, allowing priests or leaders to predict the seasons with remarkable precision. This wasn't just practical knowledge for farming, though that was certainly important. This was power. Being able to predict when the sun would reach certain positions in the sky made you look like you had a direct connection to the cosmos. Religion and politics were completely intertwined in Cahokia, as they were in most ancient societies. The leaders weren't just political figures. They were intermediaries between the human world and the spiritual world. Those massive mounds weren't just showing off. They were statements about cosmic order. The leaders lived on top of these mounds, literally elevated above everyone else, closer to the sky, closer to the sacred. Now, here's where understanding Cahokia's success becomes crucial to understanding its failure. Everything, and I mean everything, depended on agriculture. Sure, they hunted deer and fished in the Mississippi River and gathered wild foods. But the foundation of this entire civilization was corn. Corn fed the workers who built the mounds. Corn fed the artisans who created beautiful objects. Corn fed the traders who traveled hundreds of miles. Corn fed the priests and leaders. Corn was life, and corn needs the right conditions to grow. It needs enough rain, but not too much. It needs warmth, but not extreme heat. It needs a long enough growing season without killing frosts. For a while, a beautiful, golden while, Cahokia had all of this. The climate was cooperative. The floods came at predictable times. The rains arrived when needed. The sun shone warmly. Everything worked. But nature doesn't owe us anything. Nature doesn't care about our cities, our beliefs, our achievements, or our plans. Nature just does what nature does, following patterns too large for us to see, responding to forces we barely understand even today with all our modern science. And nature was about to change the rules of the game. This is where our tree friends enter the story. Remember, trees are witnesses to history in a way that humans can never be. Humans forget. Humans exaggerate. Humans lie. Humans interpret events through the lens of their own biases and beliefs. But trees just grow, and their growth leaves an undeniable record. Scientists studying ancient climate don't just look at any old trees. They need trees that were alive during the periods they're studying, which means they often look at extremely old trees that are still living, or they examine wood from ancient buildings, or they drill cores from old tree stumps that have been preserved in special conditions. For Cahokia research, scientists examined trees throughout the Midwest, looking for specimens that could tell them what the weather was like year by year during the time Cahokia rose and fell. What they found was remarkable. Let me walk you through the story those trees told, year by year, ring by ring. In the early years of Cahokia, roughly from 1000 to 1100, the rings tell a story of generally good conditions. Not perfect, never perfect, but good enough. Winters were relatively mild. Springs brought adequate rain. Summers were warm without being scorching. Falls allowed for good harvests. The Mississippi River flooded regularly, which was actually a good thing because floods deposited rich soil across the floodplains where Cahokia's farmers grew their crops. During these years, Cahokia exploded in size and complexity. Population boomed. More mounds went up. Trade networks expanded. The city became a magnet, drawing people from hundreds of miles away. Think about that for a second. What would make you leave your home, your family's land, your ancestral territory, and move to a crowded city? The promise of something better, that's what. Maybe it was food security. Maybe it was the excitement of urban life. Maybe it was religious devotion. Maybe it was economic opportunity. Probably all of the above. But here's something interesting that the tree rings revealed. Even during these good years, there were hiccups. Some years showed thinner rings, indicating mini droughts or unusual cold snaps. The climate wasn't perfectly stable. It never is. But these bad years were scattered. They weren't sustained, and the overall trend was positive enough that Cahokia could absorb the shocks. Then something changed. Around 1150, the tree rings start showing a pattern that makes climate scientists nervous. The rings get more variable, swinging between really thick and really thin more dramatically than before. This tells us that the climate was becoming less predictable, more volatile. Some years might have been great for growing corn, followed immediately by years that were terrible. This kind of unpredictability is a nightmare for agricultural societies. Imagine you're a farmer in Cahokia during this time. Last year, you got a great harvest. Your family had plenty to eat. You had surplus to trade. Life was good. So naturally, you plant more this year, expecting similar results. But this year, the rains don't come at the right time. Or maybe they come too much. Or maybe there's a late frost that kills your seedlings. Or maybe the summer is so hot that your corn withers. Suddenly, you don't have enough food for your family, let alone surplus to trade or to give as tribute to the leaders. Now multiply that experience by thousands of families. What happens to a city when its food supply becomes unreliable? Things get tense. People start questioning the leaders. If the leaders are supposed to maintain cosmic harmony and ensure good harvests, but the harvests are failing, well, maybe the leaders aren't holding up their end of the bargain. Maybe the gods are angry. Maybe the whole system is broken. But it gets worse. The tree rings revealed something else that's absolutely crucial: a mega-drought. Starting around 1150 and continuing for several decades, the trees show consistently thin rings across a wide geographic area. This wasn't just a bad year or two. This was a sustained period of below-average rainfall that would have made agriculture extremely challenging. A mega-drought in the Midwest means the Mississippi River runs lower than usual. The seasonal floods that deposited rich soil become less predictable, or might not happen at all. The soil becomes drier and less productive. Wells and springs might dry up. Game animals that people hunted would have been affected too, with populations declining as water sources disappeared. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds bad, but couldn't people just adapt? Couldn't they move their farms closer to the river? Couldn't they develop new techniques? Couldn't they just tough it out? And the answer is, they probably tried all of that. But here's the thing about complex societies like Cahokia. They're complex for a reason, and that complexity makes them both powerful and vulnerable. Think about all the people in Cahokia who weren't farmers. The artisans making pottery, the craftspeople making tools, the builders working on mounds, the priests conducting ceremonies, the leaders administering the city, the traders traveling to distant places. All of these people depended on farmers producing enough surplus food to support them. When the surplus disappears, the whole system starts to crack. And there's another factor that makes the drought even more devastating: Population pressure. Remember, Cahokia had grown massively during the good years. More people means more mouths to feed, more land needed for farming, more resources needed for everything. When times are good, a large population is a strength. More workers, more defenders, more minds, more hands. But when times are bad, a large population becomes a burden. There simply isn't enough to go around. Archaeological evidence supports what the tree rings suggest. Researchers have found that during this drought period, the types of wild foods people were eating changed. They started relying more on less preferred foods, stuff they would normally ignore if better options were available. They were making do, stretching resources, finding alternatives. The diet diversity suggests people were under nutritional stress. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, and this is something that really showcases why tree ring studies are so valuable. The drought wasn't the only problem. The climate wasn't just getting drier, it was also getting cooler. Tree rings from this period show a pattern consistent with what's called the medieval warm period ending and transitioning into cooler conditions. Now, you might think, wait, cooler weather? Wouldn't that be good? Less evaporation, maybe more moisture? Not necessarily, and definitely not for corn-dependent agriculture in the Midwest. Corn needs a certain number of warm days to mature properly. If temperatures drop even a little bit, the growing season shortens. A shorter growing season means less time for corn to develop, which means lower yields or complete crop failures if an early frost hits before the harvest is ready. And there's more. Cooler temperatures in this region meant more variable weather patterns, more frequent cold snaps, more unpredictable frosts, more storms. The tree rings from this period show what scientists call increased stress markers, patterns in the wood that indicate the trees themselves were struggling to deal with changing conditions. Let me paint you a picture of what life might have been like in Cahokia during these changing conditions. You wake up on a morning that feels colder than it should for this time of year. You walk through your neighborhood and see your neighbors looking worried, talking in hushed tones about their crops. Some families have already left, packed up their belongings and headed back to wherever they came from, or maybe they're trying their luck somewhere else entirely. The great plaza that used to be filled with traders and goods from distant lands is quieter now. Fewer people are coming to Cahokia because there's less food to trade for. The workshops, where artisans created beautiful objects, are less busy because who's buying luxury goods when they're worried about their next meal? The mounds still stand, massive and impressive, but there's no new construction happening. The leaders still conduct ceremonies on top of the mounds, still track the sun with the wood henge posts, still promise that if everyone just maintains faith and follows the proper rituals, the gods will restore prosperity. But the corn in the fields tells a different story, and people can see it with their own eyes. Here's something that really makes you think about the human side of this story. The people of Cahokia didn't have our scientific understanding of climate. They couldn't look at tree rings and see patterns. They couldn't collect data from across the region and understand that this was a widespread drought. They couldn't know that they were experiencing a climate shift that would last for decades. All they knew was that things weren't working the way they used to, and they didn't know why or when it would end. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? Your entire worldview is based on the idea that proper behavior and proper rituals maintain cosmic harmony and ensure prosperity. You've been doing everything right, following all the rules, making all the sacrifices, building all the mounds, conducting all the ceremonies, and yet, year after year, the harvests are poor, The rain doesn't come. The crops fail. What do you conclude? Maybe you're being punished for something. Maybe the leaders are doing something wrong. Maybe the entire system is broken. Maybe the gods have abandoned you. Or maybe, just maybe, it's time to leave and try something different somewhere else. The tree rings also revealed something else that researchers found fascinating. The drought wasn't uniform across all areas. Some regions were hit harder than others. This means that people living in some outlying areas might have actually had better conditions than those in Cahokia itself. News would have traveled. If you hear that your cousin's farm 200 miles away is doing fine while yours is failing, that information affects your decisions. And decisions is really what this story is about. One of the biggest misconceptions about ancient civilizations collapsing is that everyone just dies or vanishes into thin air. That's not what happens. What happens is that people make rational decisions based on the information they have and the conditions they're facing. And for many people in Cahokia, the rational decision was to leave. Leaving doesn't mean you failed. Leaving doesn't mean you're weak. Leaving means you're adapting to changed circumstances. If you're a farmer and the land isn't producing enough food for your family, staying put means your children might starve. Leaving and finding better land somewhere else means your family survives. That's not a failure of character. That's a successful adaptation to difficult circumstances. But here's the tragic part. When people start leaving a complex society like Cahokia, it creates a feedback loop. Remember all those non-farmers who depended on surplus food production? As farmers leave and food production drops, there's even less surplus to support specialists. So specialists have to leave too, or convert back to farming themselves. As specialists leave, the things that made Cahokia special, the beautiful pottery, the sophisticated trade goods, the astronomical observations, the massive construction projects, all of that starts to decline. As the city's special features decline, it becomes less of a magnet for new people. Why would you move to Cahokia now? The religious authority has been undermined by the failure to ensure good harvests. The economic opportunities are drying up. The impressive construction has stopped. The trade networks are withering. There's less and less reason to come, and more reason to leave. The tree rings document this period with brutal honesty. Year after year of thin rings, year after year of struggle, year after year of stress. And archaeological evidence shows that Cahokia's population was indeed declining during this time. The outlying settlements were abandoned first, as people consolidated closer to the city center, or left entirely. Then the city center itself started emptying out. Now, I need to emphasize something important here. The climate change revealed by the tree rings wasn't the only factor in Cahokia's decline. History is never that simple. Human societies are complex, and their failures usually involve multiple interacting factors. But what the tree rings did was provide a crucial piece of the puzzle that historians and archaeologists had been missing. Before dendrochronology studies, there were lots of theories about why Cahokia was abandoned. Maybe there was a war. Maybe there was a disease epidemic. Maybe there was political collapse or social revolution. Maybe they overexploited their environment, cutting down too many trees or depleting the soil. And you know what? Some of these theories might still be partially true. Multiple bad things can happen at the same time, and they often make each other worse. But the tree rings gave us something that other evidence couldn't, a year-by-year record of environmental conditions. They provided objective data about what the climate was doing during Cahokia's rise and fall. And that data tells us unequivocally that the people of Cahokia were dealing with a sustained period of climate stress that would have made their agricultural system extremely challenging to maintain. Let me tell you about one of the most poignant discoveries related to this. Researchers studying Cahokia found evidence of what they call defensive palisades, basically big wooden walls, being built around the city center around 1175. Now, walls mean something, right? Walls mean you're worried about threats. Walls mean you're protecting something valuable from someone. Who were they worried about? We don't know for sure, but think about it logically. When resources become scarce, tensions rise. Groups that might have been friendly trade partners during times of plenty might turn aggressive during times of scarcity. Or maybe the tensions were internal, between different factions within Cahokia itself arguing over how to respond to the crisis. Maybe the leaders built walls to maintain control over an increasingly restless population. The tree rings give us context for when these walls were built, right in the middle of the drought period. That timing isn't coincidental. Climate stress leads to resource stress, which leads to social stress, which leads to conflict. This pattern has played out again and again throughout human history, and the tree rings help us see it clearly in Cahokia's case. But here's something that gives me hope about human nature, even in this story of decline. The people who left Cahokia didn't disappear. They moved to other areas and continued their lives. Their descendants still exist today in various Native American tribes throughout the region. The knowledge, the traditions, the stories, they adapted and survived, even if the city itself didn't. And some people stayed in the Cahokia area even after the main city was largely abandoned. Small communities persisted for decades, maybe even centuries, though nothing like the grand urban center that had once existed. These folks adapted to the new normal, developed smaller-scale agricultural systems, and made do with fewer resources and smaller populations. The tree rings document the eventual end of the Mega-Drought, too. Conditions eventually improved, though not to the stable, predictable climate that had enabled Cahokia's initial rise. But by the time conditions improved, the city was already gone. The people had already left. The mounds stood empty. Nature started reclaiming what humans had built. This raises a fascinating question. If the climate had improved 50 years earlier, could Cahokia have survived? What if the drought had been shorter, or less severe, or had come at a different time when the city was less vulnerable? These are the kinds of questions that keep historians up at night, because we'll never know the answers for sure. History doesn't do controlled experiments. What we do know, thanks to those honest tree rings, is that Cahokia's story is ultimately a story about the relationship between human societies and their environment. It's a story about how we thrive when conditions are favorable and struggle when they're not. It's a story about the limits of human resilience in the face of sustained environmental stress. Now, here's where this story gets really relevant to us today. When I learned about what happened to Cahokia, I couldn't help but see parallels to our own time. We're living in a period of rapid climate change, much faster than what Cahokia experienced. We're seeing droughts in some regions, floods in others, more variable weather, more extreme events. We have massive cities that depend on complex agricultural systems. We have global supply chains that can be disrupted by environmental problems. Are we more resilient than Cahokia was? In some ways, yes. We have technology they didn't have. We have global communication and can coordinate responses across vast distances. We have scientific understanding of climate that allows us to anticipate and prepare for changes. We can store food, transport water, and adapt our agriculture in ways Cahokia couldn't. But in some ways, we're more vulnerable. Our systems are even more complex, which means there are more points of failure. Our populations are much larger, which means the stakes are much higher. We've become dependent on systems that we assume will always work. The power grid, the food supply chain, the water system, and we don't always think about what happens when they don't. The tree rings that told us Cahokia's story are still telling us stories today. Scientists are still studying ancient trees, still reading the rings, still learning about past climates, and they're also studying modern trees, watching how they respond to current climate changes, comparing what's happening now to what happened in the past. One of the most sobering things about tree ring studies is that they give us perspective on what normal climate really means. What we think of as normal, the climate conditions we've experienced during recorded human history, is actually just a snapshot of a much longer, more variable story. The climate has always changed, sometimes dramatically. What's different now is the speed of change and the fact that humans are driving much of it. The trees that lived through Cahokia's time experienced climate change that unfolded over decades and centuries. That's slow enough that some adaptation is possible, though, as we've seen, not enough for Cahokia's complex urban society. The climate change we're experiencing now is happening faster, much faster, and that should concern us. But you know what? I don't want to end this on a completely depressing note, because that's not what history is for. History isn't just about learning what went wrong, it's about learning from what went wrong so we can do better. The story of Cahokia, as told by tree rings, gives us valuable lessons. Lesson 1. Environmental conditions matter more than we often want to admit. We like to think we've conquered nature, that we're independent of environmental constraints, that technology and human ingenuity can overcome any challenge. And while human ingenuity is amazing, there are limits. Climate and environment set the parameters within which societies operate. Ignoring those parameters is dangerous. Lesson 2. Complexity is a double-edged sword. The more complex a society becomes, the more specialized and efficient it can be during good times. But complexity also creates dependencies and vulnerabilities that can become critical during bad times. This doesn't mean we should avoid complexity, but it does mean we need to build resilience into our complex systems. Lesson 3. Early warning signs matter. The tree rings showed that climate variability increased before the major drought hit. There were signals that conditions were changing. If Cahokia's leaders had understood these signals and what they meant, could they have responded differently? Could they have reduced the city's population before crisis hit? Could they have diversified their food sources? Could they have relocated the city to a better location? We don't know, but the question is worth asking. Lesson 4. Don't shoot the messenger. When the environment is telling you something through repeated crop failures and unpredictable weather, denying the reality doesn't help. The people of Cahokia probably tried to maintain faith in their system, even as evidence mounted that something fundamental had changed. That's a very human response, but it's not always helpful. Sometimes you need to acknowledge that conditions have changed and adapt accordingly. Lesson 5. Migration is adaptation. We often treat people leaving as a sign of failure, but it's not. It's a survival strategy that has worked for humans for our entire history. When conditions in one place become untenable, moving to a better place is a smart response. The people who left Cahokia weren't cowards or failures. They were survivors making rational decisions. Now, I want to talk about something that fascinates me about the detective work that went into understanding Cahokia's story. The scientists who study tree rings aren't just counting rings and measuring their width. They're doing incredibly sophisticated analysis that can tell us an amazing amount of information. They look at the density of the wood within each ring. Denser wood forms under different conditions than lighter wood. They examine the chemical composition of the wood because trees take up different isotopes of elements depending on environmental conditions. They compare patterns across many different trees to ensure they're seeing real regional patterns and not just individual tree quirks. They also cross-reference tree ring data with other climate proxies. What's a proxy? It's anything that gives us indirect information about past climate. Lake sediments, ice cores, pollen deposits, stalagmites in caves, even ancient coral reefs. All of these things record information about past climate in different ways, and when multiple proxies agree, we can be confident about our conclusions. For Cahokia, the tree ring evidence aligned beautifully with other evidence. Lake sediments from the region showed changes in pollen types that indicated a shift toward drier conditions and different plant communities. Archaeological evidence of changing diets and settlement patterns made sense in the context of prolonged drought. Everything fit together into a coherent picture. This is how science works at its best. Multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. It's not just one person's interpretation or theory. It's a convergence of data from different sources all telling the same story. And that story is written in tree rings that formed year by year, honestly recording conditions as they experience them. Let me share a specific example that really brings this home. Researchers found a particular old post from Woodhenge that they could date precisely based on its tree rings. By matching the pattern of rings in that post to patterns in other trees from the region, they could tell exactly what year the tree was cut down. And because they knew exactly when it was cut, they could look at the rings from years before that to understand what environmental conditions were like when that tree was growing. That single post became a time capsule, a direct link to the past. The rings near the center of that post, which formed when Cahokia was in its glory days, were thick and regular. Comfortable conditions, good growth. The rings farther out, formed as Cahokia was declining, were thinner and more irregular. Stressful conditions, difficult times. One piece of wood, hundreds of years old, telling a story without words. This is the power of dendrochronology. It's not speculation. It's not interpretation based on limited evidence. It's a direct physical record of past conditions. Those rings formed in response to real environmental conditions. They can't be biased. They can't forget. They can't exaggerate. They are what they are. And here's something else that's amazing. Tree rings can tell us about specific events, not just general trends. If there was a severe frost that damaged a tree during the growing season, it leaves a marker in the ring. If there was a forest fire, charcoal gets incorporated into the wood. If there was an insect outbreak that defoliated trees, they produce a distinctive pattern. If there was flooding that affected root systems, that shows up too. So tree rings aren't just giving us broad patterns like drought or cold period. They're potentially giving us information about specific years and specific events. Some researcher can look at a ring and say, this tree experienced frost damage in early June of 1157, or whatever year it was. That level of specificity is incredible. For Cahokia research, this specificity matters because it allows researchers to correlate environmental events with archaeological evidence. If we know that a particular neighborhood was abandoned around 1160 and tree rings showed that 1158-1162 were especially severe drought years, we can start to understand cause and effect. Not just drought caused people to leave, but these specific terrible years caused this specific response. Now, you might be wondering, how do we know that the trees scientists are studying actually represent conditions in the Cahokia area? What if they were studying trees from far away that experienced different conditions? This is a valid question, and it's something researchers think carefully about. The answer is that they study trees from multiple locations around Cahokia. Some trees literally from the site itself, wood that was used in construction, some from the immediate region, some from farther away. By comparing patterns across multiple locations, they can understand both local conditions and regional patterns. And here's what's cool. When a drought is severe enough to show up in trees across a wide area, we know it was a major regional event, not just a local problem. The drought that coincided with Cahokia's decline shows up in tree ring records from across the Midwest. That tells us this wasn't just Cahokia having bad luck. It was a widespread environmental change that affected large areas. This regional perspective is crucial for understanding why Cahokia's people couldn't just move their farms a few miles away or find better land nearby. The whole region was affected. There wasn't an obvious escape valve close by. To find significantly better conditions, you'd have to move far enough away that you're essentially starting over in unfamiliar territory. All right. Let's talk about something that combines humor with tragedy, because sometimes you need both to deal with difficult subjects. Imagine being a leader in Cahokia during the drought years. You've spent your entire life training for this position. You've memorized all the rituals. You've climbed to the top of mounds more times than you can count. You've tracked the sun and stars. You've done everything right. And now people are showing up at your mound being like, "Hey, so, about those crops that keep failing? What's going on with that? I thought you had a direct line to the gods." And you're standing there thinking, "I'm doing all the same stuff that worked perfectly for my predecessors. It's not my fault the weather changed." If you enjoy these historical videos, please like the video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. But seriously, imagine the pressure. In a society where leadership is based on maintaining cosmic harmony, crop failures aren't just an agricultural problem, they're a leadership crisis. They're evidence that something is fundamentally broken in the relationship between the leaders, the people, and the divine. There's no way to spin that as, "Hey, it's just climate variability. These things happen." Some leaders probably tried different approaches. Maybe they conducted more elaborate ceremonies, made bigger sacrifices, built new structures, consulted different prophecies. Anything to show they were actively working on the problem. But when year after year the crops still fail, eventually people stop believing that rituals are going to fix things. This is actually a pattern we see in many ancient societies. When environmental conditions change enough to challenge a civilization's food supply, the leadership often can't survive, even if many of the people do. The people leave or overthrow the leaders or stop supporting the system. The social structure collapses even if the population itself persists. For Cahokia, we don't have written records of what happened to the leaders. Did they maintain power until the very end, ruling over a shrinking population? Did they get overthrown in some kind of revolution? Did they themselves decide to leave and start over somewhere else? We just don't know. The tree rings tell us about climate, not politics. But we can make educated guesses based on what we know of human nature and other similar situations. Most likely, the leadership structure gradually lost legitimacy and authority as conditions worsened. Some leaders probably tried to maintain control through increasingly desperate measures. Some probably left when they saw the writing on the wall. Some probably were still there at the end, carrying out rituals in a nearly empty city, maintaining traditions that no longer meant what they once did. There's something deeply poignant about that image. A priest conducting a ceremony on top of Monk's Mound, tracking the sun's position with the woodhenge posts, performing rituals that had been performed for generations, but now doing it for an audience of a few dozen instead of thousands. The form's continuing even as the substance has disappeared. But again, I don't want to be too grim here. Yes, Cahokia as a city failed. Yes, the civilization that created those massive mounds fell apart. But the people survived. They dispersed. They adapted. They created new communities and new ways of life. Their descendants are still here, still carrying forward traditions and knowledge, still connected to that heritage, even though the city itself is gone. And honestly, maybe leaving was the best thing they could have done. Sometimes holding on to something that isn't working anymore just prolongs suffering. Sometimes the brave thing is to acknowledge that conditions have changed and you need to try something different. The people who left Cahokia and founded new communities elsewhere were making a positive choice, taking control of their own destiny instead of waiting for things to get even worse. Here's another interesting angle on the tree ring evidence. It tells us not just about Cahokia's decline, but about its rise as well. Remember, conditions during Cahokia's growth period were unusually stable and favorable. So in a sense, Cahokia was built during a lucky period. That doesn't diminish the achievements of the people who built it. They still did all that amazing work. But it does remind us that timing matters. If Cahokia had tried to develop during the drought period instead, it probably never would have gotten off the ground. You need surplus resources to build massive mounds and support large urban populations. You can't do that when you're struggling just to survive. So the favorable climate didn't just allow Cahokia to exist. It was probably necessary for Cahokia to develop in the first place. This raises interesting questions about civilization and environmental conditions. How many other potential civilizations never developed because the climate timing wasn't right? How many great cities never got built because the people who might have built them were dealing with drought or floods or cold snaps during the critical development period? We tend to assume that civilization and progress are inevitable, that human ingenuity and ambition will always find a way. But maybe it's more contingent than that. Maybe we need both human capability and environmental opportunity, and when we look at successful civilizations, we're usually looking at cases where both factors aligned. Cahokia is particularly interesting because we can see both sides of this equation. We can see the rise during favorable conditions and the fall during unfavorable ones. It's like a natural experiment, though obviously not one that anyone would choose to conduct. The tree rings also tell us something else interesting. Cahokia's climate challenges weren't unique. Other regions experienced similar problems around the same time. And guess what? Other societies in other parts of North America and around the world were also experiencing disruptions during this period. The medieval warm period ending and the transition to cooler conditions affected many places. This doesn't mean every civilization collapsed, far from it. But it does mean that many societies were stressed and had to adapt. Some adapted successfully, some didn't. Cahokia happened to be particularly vulnerable because of its size, its complexity, and its dependence on corn agriculture. A smaller, more flexible society might have weathered the same climate changes with less dramatic consequences. Size matters, and not always in a good way. A huge city with a specialized economy and complex social hierarchy is an amazing achievement during good times. It's efficient, productive, and impressive. But during bad times, all that size and specialization becomes a liability. Small groups can move, can shift strategies, can make quick decisions. Big cities can't do any of those things easily. There's a concept in ecology called resilience, which is basically the ability of a system to absorb disturbances and still maintain its basic structure and function. Some systems are highly resilient. They can take a lot of hits and bounce back. Other systems are fragile. One good shock and they collapse. Cahokia turns out to have been relatively fragile, though nobody knew that until conditions changed. During good times, the system looked strong and stable. It had been growing for generations. But it was actually dependent on specific environmental conditions, and when those conditions changed, the system couldn't adapt fast enough. This is a warning that applies to modern societies too. Systems that look strong and permanent might actually be fragile if they depend on conditions that we assume will never change. Identifying those dependencies and building in resilience is crucial for long-term survival. Now let's talk about one of the coolest aspects of tree ring research. It's still ongoing. Scientists are still studying trees, still refining their techniques, still discovering new information. Every few years, new papers come out that add details to the Cahokia story or revise our understanding of particular aspects. For example, recent studies have looked at tree rings with even more sophisticated chemical analysis techniques than were available earlier. These studies can detect things like pollution levels in the past, which tells us about human activities. They found evidence of large-scale deforestation around Cahokia during its peak. Makes sense, right? All those people needed wood for buildings, for fires, for palisades, for everything. But here's where it gets interesting. The deforestation probably made the climate problems worse. Trees help regulate local climate. They provide shade, they retain moisture, they prevent soil erosion. Cut down a bunch of trees, and suddenly the local area gets hotter, drier, and more vulnerable to erosion. So Cahokia's own success, which required using lots of wood, may have made them more vulnerable to the drought when it hit. This is what we call a feedback loop, and it's not a good kind. Human activities change the environment. Changed environment creates problems. Problems lead to more desperate resource use, which changes the environment further, which creates more problems. Round and round it goes. Did the people of Cahokia understand this? Probably not, at least not in the way we do now. But they might have noticed that things were getting worse over time, that even during years with decent rain, crops weren't doing as well as they used to. The degraded soil, the changed local climate, these things would have been observable even if the causes weren't understood. Here's a mind-blowing thought. What if we could talk to someone from Cahokia and explain to them what tree rings reveal about their climate? How would they react to learning that their downfall was partly caused by environmental factors beyond their control? Would they be relieved to know it wasn't their fault? That they didn't anger the gods? That they didn't do anything wrong? Or would they be frustrated to learn they were up against a force they couldn't have understood or fought effectively? I think about this sometimes when I look at challenges we face today. We have so much more knowledge than ancient people did. We understand climate. We understand ecology. We understand complex systems. But does that knowledge actually help us avoid the same kinds of problems? Or are we just more aware of what's happening while still feeling powerless to change course? That's too philosophical. Let me bring it back to the trees. One of the things I love about tree ring research is how democratic it is in a sense. Trees don't care about social status. They don't record different information for rich people versus poor people. They don't write official histories that emphasize certain events and ignore others. They just grow, responding to their environment, creating an honest record. This means that tree rings can sometimes contradict official narratives or reveal things that don't show up in other historical sources. For example, if written records claim that a certain period was prosperous, but tree rings show severe drought, we know something's off. Either the written records are propaganda, or they're talking about a specific location that wasn't affected, or they're defining prosperity in ways that don't include environmental conditions. For Cahokia, we don't have written records at all, so tree rings are one of our most important sources of information. But the principle applies to other historical cases too. Trees keep rulers honest, you might say, even rulers who lived 1,000 years ago. Speaking of honesty, let's be honest about something. Understanding what happened to Cahokia doesn't give us a simple lesson we can apply to our own problems. History isn't a straightforward teacher where you just learn, this bad thing happened because of this mistake, so don't make that mistake. Real history is messy and complex and full of contingencies and factors that interact in unpredictable ways. What tree rings do give us is data, reliable, objective data about what environmental conditions were like in the past. What we do with that data, how we interpret it, what lessons we draw from it, that's up to us. And different people might draw different lessons from the same data, which is fine. That's how humans work. But at least we're working from a solid foundation. At least we know what the climate was actually doing during Cahokia's time. We're not just guessing or relying on myths and legends. We have tree rings that formed year by year, recording conditions as they happened. That's valuable, no matter how you interpret it. Let me tell you about one researcher who really helped pioneer dendrochronology studies in the Cahokia region. Her name, actually, I don't want to name specific researchers because this is about the science, not personalities. But the point is that someone had to be the first to say, hey, what if we look at tree rings to understand what was happening climatically during Cahokia's time? Someone had to collect samples, measure rings, compare patterns, crunch numbers, write papers, convince other researchers that this was a valuable approach. Science doesn't just happen automatically. It requires individuals who are curious enough to ask new questions and persistent enough to pursue answers even when it's difficult and time-consuming. Tree ring analysis is painstaking work. You're measuring rings that might be millimeters wide, recording data for hundreds of years' worth of rings, comparing patterns across multiple trees, doing statistical analysis to separate signal from noise. And then, after you've done all that work, you have to communicate your findings to people who might not understand or care about dendrochronology. You have to explain why tree rings matter, why they're reliable, how they complement other evidence. You have to defend your methods and your conclusions against skeptics. It's not easy. But the result of all that effort is that we now understand Cahokia's story in a way that wouldn't have been possible without tree ring studies. We know that climate change played a crucial role in the city's decline. We know roughly when conditions deteriorated. We know how severe the changes were. We know that this was a regional phenomenon, not just local bad luck. That knowledge matters because it changes how we think about Cahokia. Instead of just a mysterious abandoned city, it becomes an understandable case of humans struggling with environmental challenges and ultimately making the rational decision to relocate when conditions became untenable. That's not a story of failure, it's a story of adaptation. And it's a story that's still relevant today. We're living in a time of rapid environmental change, much of it caused by human activities. We're going to face challenges in the coming decades that will test our resilience, our adaptability, and our wisdom. Looking at how past societies dealt with environmental challenges can give us perspective and hopefully some wisdom. Will we be smarter than Cahokia? Will we adapt in time? Will we make the necessary changes to our systems before crisis forces changes upon us? These are open questions, but at least we have the advantage of knowledge. We can see what's coming in ways that the people of Cahokia couldn't. We can study tree rings and ice cores and all sorts of other climate data and understand long-term patterns. We have options they didn't have. The question is whether we'll use that knowledge and those options wisely. And that's up to us, collectively, as a society and as a species. The trees will keep recording what we do, growing rings year by year, creating a record for future scientists to study. What story will our rings tell? That's being written right now. Let me circle back to something I mentioned earlier, but want to emphasize. The people who built Cahokia were not primitive or unsophisticated. They created something amazing with the tools and knowledge they had available. The fact that their city eventually declined doesn't diminish their achievements. If anything, understanding the environmental challenges they faced makes their achievements even more impressive. Think about building Monk's Mound with nothing but baskets and wooden tools. Think about coordinating thousands of people to work on construction projects. Think about establishing trade networks that spanned a continent. Think about creating astronomical calendars that accurately predicted celestial events. Think about feeding a city of tens of thousands of people with pre-industrial agriculture. These are not small things. These are remarkable accomplishments that required intelligence, organization, planning, and sustained effort over generations. The people who did this were every bit as smart and capable as we are today. They just had different tools and different knowledge. And actually, in some ways, they might have been more impressive than us. We have access to accumulated knowledge from thousands of years of human civilization. We have written language, we have science, we have technology. They were figuring things out from scratch, or at least from much more limited starting points. Every innovation they made was hard-won. So when we look at Cahokia's decline as revealed by tree rings, we shouldn't think, those foolish ancient people couldn't handle a little climate change. We should think, even smart, capable people with sophisticated social organization can be overwhelmed by sustained environmental stress. That's a very different lesson, and a much more relevant one for us today. Because if they couldn't handle it with their level of technology and knowledge, what makes us think we can handle similar or greater challenges? We have advantages they didn't, absolutely. But we also have vulnerabilities they didn't. Our systems are even more complex. Our populations are even larger. Our dependencies are even more extensive. The tree rings of Cahokia are ultimately a cautionary tale, but not in the simple moralistic sense of they did something wrong so they suffered. It's more like they built something amazing during favorable conditions, and when conditions changed dramatically, the system couldn't adapt quickly enough. That's a much more nuanced lesson, and it applies to any complex human system operating in a changing environment. Now, I want to address something that some people might be thinking. Okay, but climate change is natural. It happened to Cahokia naturally. So why should we worry about modern climate change? This is a common confusion, so let me be clear. Yes, the climate change that affected Cahokia was natural. It was part of long-term climate variability driven by factors like solar radiation, ocean currents, and atmospheric circulation patterns. Nobody was burning fossil fuels 1,000 years ago. The people of Cahokia weren't causing the drought that helped bring down their city. But that doesn't mean climate change is harmless or something we shouldn't worry about. Natural climate change destroyed Cahokia's ability to function as a city. Natural climate change forced thousands of people to leave their homes and relocate. Natural climate change disrupted trade networks, undermined political authority, and ended a unique chapter in human history. If natural climate change could do all that, imagine what human-caused climate change might do, especially considering it's happening faster and affecting a world with billions of people who depend on complex systems. The fact that climate has changed naturally in the past doesn't make modern climate change less concerning. If anything, it shows us how serious climate impacts can be. The tree rings of Cahokia are a warning. Climate matters. Environment matters. You can't just ignore changing conditions and hope everything will be fine. Societies that don't adapt to changing environmental realities face serious consequences, even collapse. And here's the thing. We know this is true, not just because of Cahokia, but because of many other cases throughout history. The Maya civilization dealt with droughts revealed by climate records. The ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest faced similar challenges. Civilizations in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, all over the world, have risen during favorable climate periods and struggled during unfavorable ones. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't ancient history that has no relevance to us. This is a fundamental truth about human civilization. We depend on our environment, and when that environment changes significantly, we have to adapt or suffer the consequences. Okay, let me lighten things up a bit because I've been pretty heavy for a while here. Let's talk about some of the more interesting specific details that tree rings revealed about daily life in Cahokia. Because it's not just about big climate patterns, it's also about what those patterns meant for actual people living actual lives. For example, tree rings can tell us about specific growing seasons. There was apparently a year, around 1165 or so, when a late spring frost hit right after trees had started leafing out. You can see this in the tree rings as a marker of damaged tissue that healed. Now, that same frost that damaged trees would have absolutely devastated corn seedlings if farmers had already planted them. Imagine you're a farmer, and you've just spent weeks preparing fields, planting corn, getting everything ready. And then, boom, overnight frost kills all your seedlings. You have to start over, but now you're late in the season, which means your corn might not have time to mature before fall frosts. One bad night potentially ruins your entire year. That's the kind of specific insight tree rings can provide. Or here's another one. Tree rings show evidence of several years in a row when spring was unusually dry, followed by heavy summer rains. That might sound okay, like at least you're getting rain. But the timing is terrible for agriculture. Corn needs moisture early in the growing season to germinate and establish itself. If spring is dry, seeds might not even germinate properly. And then heavy summer rains after a dry spring can lead to flooding and erosion. So it's not just about total annual rainfall, it's about when the rain comes and in what patterns. Tree rings can capture this kind of detailed information because trees respond to seasonal conditions, not just yearly averages. There's also evidence in tree rings of what scientists call compound events, which is when multiple bad things happen close together. Like, you get a drought, and then the following year, you get an early frost, and then the year after that, you get flooding. Each individual event might be manageable, but 3 bad years in a row. That's when systems start to break down. Cahokia apparently experienced several of these compound event clusters during the decline period. Just bad luck on top of bad luck on top of bad luck. And there's only so much bad luck a society can absorb before it can't bounce back anymore. This concept of compound events is actually really important for understanding collapse. It's rarely just one thing that does in a civilization. It's usually a combination of factors that happen close enough together that the society can't recover from one before the next hits. Tree rings help us see these patterns of compounding problems in a way that other evidence might miss. Now, here's a question I've been asked. Couldn't Cahokia's people have just switched to different crops that were more drought-resistant? Why stick with corn if it kept failing? This seems like an obvious solution, right? The answer is that it's not that simple. First, corn was already one of the best options available. It was productive enough in good years to support a large population and create surplus. Most alternative crops wouldn't have been as productive, which means they couldn't support the same population density. Switching crops might have meant the city couldn't be sustained at the same size regardless. Second, agricultural transitions take time. You can't just decide one year, okay, we're doing something completely different now. You need seeds or plants of the new crop. You need to learn how to grow it successfully. You need to figure out how to process and store it. You need to adjust your whole calendar and work patterns around different growing requirements. This process takes years, maybe generations, to do properly. Third, the drought was regional. If corn was failing in Cahokia's area, other crops would have struggled too. A drought is a drought. You can't wish water into existence by planting different seeds. What was the question I asked? Oh, right, why not switch crops? Fourth reason, cultural and religious factors. Corn wasn't just food, it was central to Mississippian worldview and ritual. Abandoning corn would have meant abandoning part of their cultural identity. That's possible. People do adapt their cultures, but it's not easy, and it doesn't happen quickly. So while crop switching might seem like an obvious solution from our perspective, it really wasn't a viable option for Cahokia in the time frame they had. The climate was changing faster than their agricultural system could adapt. This is another lesson relevant to modern times. People often propose what seem like simple solutions to complex problems. Just switch to different technologies. Just move people around. Just change how we do things. But in reality, complex systems can't change quickly without breaking. There's always inertia, always dependencies, always lag time between recognizing a problem and implementing solutions. The people of Cahokia weren't stupid for not switching crops. They were caught in a situation where the timescale of environmental change was faster than the timescale of social and agricultural adaptation. That's a trap that any society can fall into if conditions change quickly enough. All right, let's talk about one more really cool thing that tree rings revealed. Evidence of how people were using wood in Cahokia and how that changed over time. Early tree ring samples from Cahokia structures show that they were using large, old-growth trees. These are trees that had been growing for centuries, massive, straight trunks, perfect for construction. But later, samples show that they were increasingly using smaller, younger trees. This tells us that they were running out of old-growth trees, probably because they'd cut down most of the ones nearby. They had to make do with younger trees that weren't as ideal for construction, but were what was available. This pattern of resource depletion shows up in the tree ring record in multiple ways. Not only the size of trees being used for construction, but also changes in the species composition of nearby forests. As preferred species were cut down, different species filled in the gaps. The ring patterns reflect these ecological changes. So the tree rings tell us not just about climate, but about human impact on the environment around Cahokia. They document the deforestation. They show us resource depletion in real time. They reveal how the landscape was being transformed by human activity. And here's where it all comes together. Deforestation made the effects of drought worse. Drought made it harder to sustain the population. Declining population meant declining trade and specialization. Declining trade meant declining motivation to stay. People leaving meant less maintenance of infrastructure. Deteriorating infrastructure made life harder for those who remained, creating more motivation to leave. Round and round in a spiral of decline, all documented by tree rings that just kept growing and recording year after year. It's almost poetic in a sad way. The trees witnessed Cahokia's rise and fall. They absorbed water when it was available and struggled when it wasn't, just like the people. Some of them got cut down to build the city's structures, ending their lives in service to human ambition. Others kept growing in the forests around the city, recording the changing conditions, the stresses, the struggles. And now, centuries later, we can read those trees and understand what happened. We can give voice to a civilization that left no written records. We can tell their story, not from myths or guesses, but from objective environmental data preserved in annual growth rings. When I think about a scientist carefully measuring tree rings, recording data, comparing patterns, I imagine them as translators. They're translating the language of trees into human understanding. They're bridging centuries and connecting us to people long dead through the medium of wood and time. There's something beautiful about that, something that connects us to the natural world in a deep way. We're not separate from nature. We're part of it, dependent on it, affected by it. The trees know this. They've always known it. Maybe we're finally learning to listen. So what happened to Cahokia? The trees tell us that a once great city rose during favorable climate conditions, grew to impressive size and sophistication, then faced sustained environmental stress that its systems couldn't handle. The people made rational decisions to leave and seek better conditions elsewhere. The city gradually emptied out over several decades. The mounds slowly weathered and eroded, though many still stand today as testament to what was achieved. Nature reclaimed the area. Trees grew where houses had stood. Grass covered the plazas. The Mississippi River kept flowing, indifferent to the human drama that had played out on its banks. And in the forests around the former city, trees kept growing, adding rings year by year, recording a story that we would eventually learn to read. Today, Cahokia Mounds is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can visit and walk on top of Monk's Mound, look out over the landscape, and imagine what it was like when this was a thriving city. You can see the remains of wood henge posts, reconstructed based on archaeological evidence. You can visit a museum that displays artifacts and explains the history, but you can't see the most important evidence directly. The tree rings that tell Cahokia's climate story are in laboratories and museums, thin cores of wood carefully preserved and studied. They don't make for dramatic museum displays. They're just wood with rings. You have to understand what you're looking at to appreciate their significance. And that's kind of perfect, actually. The most important truths often aren't obvious. They require patience to discover, expertise to interpret, and effort to understand. Tree rings are like that. They're subtle. They require careful study, but they reveal truths that no other source can provide. The story of Cahokia, as told by tree rings, is ultimately a human story. It's about people trying to build something meaningful, creating a society and culture that mattered to them, achieving remarkable things through collective effort. It's about facing challenges they couldn't fully understand or control. It's about making difficult decisions when conditions changed. It's about adaptation and survival, even if it meant leaving behind what they'd built. And it's a reminder that we're not so different from them. We're building societies. We're facing environmental challenges. We're making decisions about how to respond to changing conditions. We have more knowledge and better tools than they did, but we're still fundamentally facing the same basic challenge. How do humans thrive in a changing environment? The trees are still watching, still growing, still recording. What story will they tell about our time? What will future scientists learn when they study rings from trees growing today? Will they see patterns of stress and struggle? Or will they see evidence that we learned from the past and adapted successfully? That's up to us. The trees will simply record what happens, honestly and objectively, year by year, ring by ring. They don't lie. They never have. They never will. Cahokia's story, revealed through tree rings, is a gift from the past. It's information we can use to make better decisions today. It's evidence that environmental conditions matter tremendously for human societies. It's a reminder that even impressive civilizations are not invulnerable to sustained environmental stress. But it's also a story of human resilience. The descendants of Cahokia's people are still here. Their cultures evolved and adapted and survived. They didn't disappear. They just changed and moved and continued on. That's not failure. That's what humans do. We adapt. We persist. We survive. Maybe that's the real lesson of the tree rings. Not that Cahokia failed, but that its people succeeded in surviving by adapting to new realities. They read the signs. They made tough choices. They moved on. And life continued. The trees bore witness to all of it. They stood in the forests around Cahokia, growing quietly, adding rings year by year. They watched the city rise from nothing to greatness. They felt the climate change in their roots and leaves and recorded it in their wood. They watched the people leave and the city empty. They kept growing long after the last person left. And now, centuries later, they're still teaching us, still sharing their story, still telling us truths we need to hear. All we have to do is learn to read their language, to understand what those rings mean, to translate growth patterns into historical understanding. Tree rings don't lie. They can't. They are what they are, a physical record of past conditions, preserved in wood, waiting for someone to read them. The story they tell about Cahokia is clear. This was a great city that rose during favorable times and fell when conditions changed beyond what its systems could handle. It's a story worth remembering. It's a warning worth heeding. It's a lesson worth learning. And it's all written in tree rings, year by year, layer by layer, truth by truth. The trees remember what we forget. The trees tell us what we need to know. The trees don't lie. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen to what they're telling us, if we learn from the past they've preserved, if we understand the patterns they've recorded, we can make better choices for our own future. We can build societies that are more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of handling environmental changes. Or maybe we'll ignore the lessons, make the same mistakes, and leave our own story written in future tree rings for future scientists to study and shake their heads at. They knew, those future scientists might say. They had the information. They understood the patterns. But they didn't change course in time. I really hope that's not how our story ends. I hope we're smarter than that. I hope we learn. Because the trees are watching. The trees are recording. The trees are growing their rings year by year, documenting what we do and what happens as a result. And the trees don't lie. They never have. They never will. So here we are, at the end of this story, or maybe at the beginning of a new chapter in our own story. We've learned about Cahokia, about tree rings, about climate change and human adaptation. We've seen how a great civilization rose and fell, all documented in the annual growth rings of trees that stood witness to history. What do we do with this knowledge? That's the question facing us now. Do we learn from Cahokia's experience? Do we recognize the warning signs in our own time? Do we act to build more resilient systems before crisis forces change upon us? The trees will keep recording regardless. They'll add rings year by year, thick or thin, recording conditions as they experience them. They'll document our successes and failures, our wisdom and folly, our adaptations and mistakes. And someday, maybe centuries from now, some scientist will carefully measure those rings, record the data, compare the patterns, and piece together the story of our time. They'll see what we did, how we responded to challenges, what choices we made. What story do you want those tree rings to tell? What evidence do you want to leave behind? What legacy do you want future generations to discover when they read the rings from trees growing in our time? These aren't just rhetorical questions. These are real questions that we answer through our actions, through our choices, through what we prioritize and what we ignore. Every day, we're writing the story that future tree rings will preserve. The people of Cahokia didn't know their actions and experiences were being recorded in tree rings. They didn't know that centuries later, scientists would read those rings and understand what happened to them. They just lived their lives, made their choices, dealt with their challenges as best they could. We have an advantage they didn't. We know we're being recorded. We understand that our actions have consequences that will be preserved in environmental records. We know that future generations will be able to look back and judge how well we dealt with the challenges of our time. Does that knowledge change anything? Does it make us more responsible, more thoughtful, more forward-looking? I hope so. I really hope so, because the trees are watching, the trees are recording, the trees are growing their annual rings, documenting what we do and what happens as a result. And the trees don't lie. They never have. They never will. Cahokia's story, as revealed by tree rings, is now part of human knowledge. It's a story of achievement and challenge, success and adaptation, building and leaving. It's a story that teaches us about the relationship between human societies and their environment. It's a story that warns us about the consequences of ignoring environmental change. But most importantly, it's a story that reminds us we're not separate from nature. We're part of it. We depend on it. We're affected by it. And our impacts on it create feedback loops that affect us in turn. The trees know this. They've always known this. They're rooted in the ground, directly connected to soil and water and air and climate. They can't ignore environmental conditions. They can't pretend they're independent of nature. They just respond to conditions and record what happens in their growth rings. Maybe that's the ultimate lesson of dendrochronology, of studying tree rings to understand history. Maybe it's not just about learning specific facts about past climate or ancient civilizations. Maybe it's about learning to think like a tree, to understand ourselves as part of natural systems, to recognize our dependence on environmental conditions. If we could think like trees, if we could be as honest as tree rings, if we could record and acknowledge reality as directly as annual growth rings do, maybe we'd make better decisions. maybe we'd be more careful about how we treat our environment. Maybe we'd be more thoughtful about building resilient systems. Maybe we'd learn the lessons that Cahokia's trees have been trying to teach us. The trees don't lie. They can't. They just grow and record and witness and preserve. They're the most honest historians we have, documenting environmental conditions year by year, with perfect accuracy and complete indifference to what we wish was true. So when tree rings tell us that Cahokia faced sustained drought during its decline, we can believe them. When they tell us that climate conditions changed in ways that made agriculture difficult, we can trust them. When they document the stress and struggle and challenging conditions that people faced, we can know it's true. And when modern tree rings show us patterns of change in our own time, when they document rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns and increasing climate variability, we should believe them too. Because the trees don't lie. They never have. They never will. Cahokia is gone. The city empty. The people dispersed. But the story lives on in the rings of trees that were there, that witnessed it all, that recorded everything in wood and time. And that story has something to teach us if we're willing to listen. The question is, are we listening? Are we learning? Are we adapting? Or are we ignoring the lessons, dismissing the warnings, assuming it can't happen to us? The trees are watching. The trees are recording. The trees are growing their rings year by year. And someday, someone will read those rings and know what we did and what happened as a result. What story will they read? What will the trees tell them about us? Will it be a story of wisdom and adaptation, or a story of warning ignored and consequences suffered? That's up to us. The trees will simply record whatever happens, honestly and objectively, ring by ring, year by year, truth by truth. Because the trees don't lie. They can't. They won't. They just grow and record and witness and teach, if we're willing to learn. And the story of Cahokia, preserved in tree rings, is one of the most important lessons they have to teach us. A lesson about civilization and environment, success and challenge, achievement and adaptation. A lesson written in wood and time, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, waiting to change how we think about our relationship with the world around us. The trees remember what we forget. The trees preserve what we lose. The trees teach what we need to learn. All we have to do is read their rings, understand their language, and apply their lessons to our own lives and our own time. Because if there's one thing the story of Cahokia teaches us, it's that environmental conditions matter. Climate matters. Sustainability matters. Resilience matters. Adaptation matters. The people of Cahokia learned this the hard way, through experience, through struggle, through having to abandon a city they'd spent generations building. But they survived. They adapted. They moved on. Their descendants are still here. And maybe that's the hopeful note to end on. Not that civilizations can fall, we know that, but that people survive and adapt and continue, that life goes on, that humanity persists. The trees bore witness to Cahokia's entire story, from rise to peak to decline, and they bore witness to what came after, life continuing, ecosystems recovering, new growth replacing old, the cycles of nature proceeding regardless of human drama. There's something reassuring about that, actually. Even when civilizations fall, life continues. The trees keep growing, the rivers keep flowing, the sun keeps rising. And people, resilient and adaptive as we've always been, keep surviving and finding ways forward. The tree rings of Cahokia tell a story that's both sobering and hopeful. sobering because they document how vulnerable even great civilizations can be to environmental change. Hopeful because they document that people survived, adapted, and continued despite tremendous challenges. So what's our story going to be? What will our tree rings tell future generations? Will we learn from Cahokia's experience, or will we repeat it? Will we adapt to changing conditions in time, or will we wait until crisis forces change upon us? These are the questions before us now. Questions that we answer through our choices, our actions, our priorities. Questions that will be recorded in tree rings growing right now, documenting our time, preserving our story. The trees are watching. The trees are recording. The trees are growing their rings, year by year, layer by layer. And the trees don't lie. They documented Cahokia's story with perfect honesty. They'll document our story the same way. The question is what that story will say. Choose wisely, act thoughtfully, learn from the past, build for the future, because the trees are watching and the trees don't lie, never have, never will. And that, ultimately, is both the warning and the wisdom that tree rings offer us. They tell the truth, always, without exception. No spin, no exaggeration, no denial. Just facts, preserved in wood, waiting to teach us if we're willing to learn. If you enjoy these historical videos, please like the video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. The story of Cahokia, as told by tree rings, is now your story too. You've learned what happened, you understand the patterns, you know the lessons. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But remember, the trees are still growing. The rings are still forming. The story is still being written, and it includes all of us, whether we realize it or not, because we're all part of the same systems, the same cycles, the same relationships between humans and environment that affected Cahokia and will affect us too. We can't escape it. We can't ignore it. We can only understand it and work with it and adapt to it. The trees know this. They've always known it. Maybe it's time we learned it too. Before our story, like Cahokia's, becomes a cautionary tale written in tree rings for future generations to study and learn from. The choice is ours. The time is now. The trees are watching, and the trees don't lie.